Our first speaker tonight is Ellen Gould, a member of the Council of Canadians, and she has been giving workshops in Vancouver and British Columbia on the privatization of the public sector. Please welcome Ellen Gould.
So first of all, I want to give a pep talk. You only have about 3 months till the WTO is here. I know that people work very hard on their own causes, but you have an historical role here. And if you don't do something about the WTO, you're going to have to do a lot of work over the coming years. So why don't you put in the effort now? This is a little pitch. Help Sally out, because she's working like a maniac all the time, and put in that extra, whoa. Whose mic is this?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I hope I'm not trying to get blood out of a stone here, but if people can put in that extra push, it would certainly help the people of the world out. And so Seattle has a particular role to play. And I think just the fact that it's Sunday, it's 6 o'clock, and you're all here is a really good indication of what's possible. So I really appreciate that everybody came out. Now, how many people have heard of the MAI? Because I just want to get a sense of my audience here. So pretty well everybody, okay. Because what I'm going to try and do is something that I've done with groups in Canada, and people are always at all kinds of different levels on these issues. So unfortunately, some of this is going to be policy wonk stuff. It's going to be recorded, and it's going to union people who will have to take it up in terms of applying this agreement to their own circumstances. So I'm sorry if it's a lot of detail here. I came along with handouts. Everything I'm saying you can pick up. If you're an organization, you can put your own stamp on it and put it out as your own stuff. There's no intellectual property rights in this room. So as Sally mentioned, I work with the Council of Canadians, but that's just one of the many groups that I work with. And just before, when we were waiting in the audience, I was telling someone that my last job was working for the government of British Columbia on an explicitly anti-MAI project. What I did was I worked with different sectors, like seniors, cultural groups, environmental groups, labor, municipalities, analyzing what the MAI would do to their sector. And he expressed surprise that a government would do that. But I think we have to expand our imagination about what we should expect from governments. Because why wouldn't a government help its people understand these agreements? So after I finished working on this project for the BC government, I continue to work with groups on a freelance basis, partly because once you get into trade and investment negotiation issues, it's hard to turn to anything else. It just seems so incredible what they're doing. But also because I came across documents that seem to tell me in a very explicit way where the MAI is going. And I think the MAI is going into something called the General Agreement on Trade and Services. I'd like us to see a show of hands if anybody's ever heard of that. Okay. Well, that's good. That's more than your politicians, probably. Some people are blaming me here in the audience. So, to give some backing on that, I'm going to quote this guy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He came to our WTO hearings in Canada, and he said, and so here's a real broad clue about where the MAI is going from somebody who should know. Absent the attempt to integrate a comprehensive set of disciplines on investment into the WTO, in other words, they don't think it's possible because of people like you that'll oppose it. They're not going to come out with another MAI that's explicitly called an MAI at the WTO because you'd be on them too hard. So instead, he thinks that the looming investment agenda in Geneva offers a lot of scope for moving forward on investment in ways that are of use both to investors and to host countries. And I would surmise that the negotiations that are about to resume under the General Agreement on Trade and Services offer quite significant potential for achieving that objective. So what this policy wonk guy, who's from Harvard, says is that the MAI is going to the WTO through the negotiations on services. So we should take our hints from this guy. They keep dropping really broad clues about what they're doing, and I think we should pay attention. So what is the General Agreement on Trade and Services? The GATS is an existing agreement that is administered by the WTO. I want to emphasize that it's an existing agreement. It's not something that may or may not be signed in the future. It already exists. All of the most powerful clauses that we worried about in the MAI, the stuff that doesn't let people gain from foreign investment in their country, the stuff that makes it apply to every level of government, federal, state, county, and even to non-governmental organizations. This is all in the GATS already. This is how the WTO promotes the GATS on its own website. So for me, this is clue number 2. The GATS is the first multilateral agreement to provide legally enforceable rights to trade in all services. It has a built-in commitment to continuous liberalization through periodic negotiations. I just want to stop there. That's what I call the Energizer Bunny clause, because it'll just keep going and going and going until they've liberalized and privatized everything. Okay? So that's built right into the agreement, that they're going to keep meeting and they're going to keep liberalizing all services. And people can say, well, so what? What's a service? Pretty much everything is a service. The only thing, they define service in sort of a flip way by saying that anything that you can't drop on your foot is a service, okay? And again, in the WTO's own words, the GATS is the world's first multilateral agreement on investment. We should dummy up here. This is what they're saying. The WTO is saying that the GATS is the first multilateral agreement on investment, since it covers not just cross-border trade, but every possible means of supplying a service, including the right to set up a commercial presence in the export market. So I want to tell you what that'll mean for Canadians. I think Canadian Studies here is partly sponsoring this, so I'll throw in a little application to the Canadian situation. For Canadians, it would mean the death of Medicare. With these provisions in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, as applied to health care, it would destroy Canadian Medicare. And that's because our system is based on health care provision by nonprofits. You cannot be a private corporation and deliver hospital services in Canada. Yeah, I think it's pretty good. Universal Medicare could not work with the high costs inflicted on health care by private corporations. It just wouldn't work. In order for Medicare to survive at all, everybody has to stay in the same health care boat, which means that you cannot have private corporations coming in, taking the cream out of the system, which would be wealthy people going to get premium care at private clinics. And why that is, just in practical terms, is that wealthy people, if they're paying the money to get good care, why are they going to turn around and fund a universal Medicare system? They figure that they're being taxed twice. Are you getting anything? Okay. So that's just the practical way of how Medicare would be taken down. If Canada agrees to having the GATS apply to health care, then foreign corporations are given the automatic, guaranteed right to set up within our territory. And that means that we could not sustain a public health care system like we have now. Now, when a former assistant to the US Trade Representative gave a paper to the Brookings Institute this summer, and he just made a sweeping statement. He just said quite categorically that overregulation and restrictions on entry by foreign service providers inevitably result in low quality, high cost, and outdated services. This is the mentality, that everybody knows this and it's unquestionable. So he makes a sweeping statement that entry by foreign service providers is automatically a good thing. Well, this is demonstrably false in the case of Canadian Medicare. By restricting entry of foreign private medical services into Canada, we've been able to keep our healthcare costs down. We actually spend less per capita than you do in the US, and we have universal coverage. So foreign entry by private multinationals would not be to the benefit of the average Canadian. But this is the mentality of people who work within the trade, within trade departments. It's just, the ideology is absolutely firm. They have no questions about the things that they say. But the guaranteed rights the General Agreement on Trade and Services gives to foreign service providers, what's called the National Treatment Provisions. Ring any bells for anybody? MAI, National Treatment? Can't distinguish between a domestic and a foreign supplier of a service. Perhaps more than any other agreement that is supposed to be about trade, the GATS is far more than this. It is a privatization agreement. It is a deregulation agreement. Rather than its current name, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, it should really be called the General Agreement on the Privatization of Everything, or maybe the General Agreement on Eliminating All Regulation for Everybody. So there's two. Somebody probably could come up with a nifty little acronym for it. I couldn't come up with something that actually fit, but this is an agreement that goes by a false name. It's not about trade, it's about how you rule your own communities. And you see this, I'm going to go into what's exactly in it, and I hope I don't lose people here. There is a clause, so if you go to the WTO site, you can actually read this thing. It's sitting right there. It's not that hard to understand in comparison with the MAI.
What is that site?
WTO, www.wto.org. I go to it all the time. It's, and you can just read the agreement right there. So again, it's not something that may or may not happen. This is sort of like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. It's got a clause in there that might reassure you. It says it doesn't apply to anything that's done in the exercise of governmental authority, which sort of sounds like it protects public services, right? Nothing done in the exercise of governmental authority. But they've written clauses into this that make it useless. Anything done in the exercise of governmental authority, but anything that is done on a commercial basis is no longer done in the exercise of governmental authority. So why would that be a problem? All kinds of public services now are turning to fee-for-service, right? Libraries, you can probably think of some other examples where public services start to charge. So would they be considered in the public sector or not? They probably wouldn't. Another huge problem with this clause is that it does exempt public services except where there are private competitors. There's private. Good. This is a very smart crowd. Why is that a problem? You have private competitors to public schools. You have private competitors anywhere in your territory, anywhere within the US of A, where you have a private supplier of the service, then they're in competition. So, for example, there are people running private library systems in the United States. So your public libraries, the Seattle Public Library is still a public library, huh? Oh, good. Well, anyway, I'm counting a few things. In some places it isn't. It's being, in some states they're having their libraries run by private corporations. So anyways, I can just imagine the trade lawyers looking at this and going, oh, goody, this is great. We can just use this one and do challenge after challenge to public services. There are two key parts of the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which tell governments what they can and cannot do quite independently of foreign trade considerations. So even if even if Canada or Germany or whoever, Malaysia, is not banging on your door wanting access to your market, you still have to revise your regulations. You kind of go, wait a minute, this is supposed to be about trade. This is supposed to be the World Trade Organization. So if you don't have any traders interested in coming into your market, why do you have the WTO telling you what to do in Seattle or King County generally? Like, why? How do they have the nerve, you could ask. You can just see them having this little trade window, and they reach through and they pull everything through it. So everything becomes trade-related, okay? One policy wonk said it's tangentially related. So when they call it the TRIPS agreement, they really mean, rather than trade-related, they mean tangentially related to trade. So there's two big provisions. One's just straight up front called domestic regulation. A whole section in the GATS telling what you can and cannot do with domestic regulation. Talk about in your face, right? There they are. So you come under a WTO magnifying glass. And any corporation, be it domestic or foreign, can demand to go before an appeal board, which your governments have to set up for this purpose. And it has to be independent of your politicians. And then they can challenge anything that has not been done in a reasonable, objective, and impartial manner. Well, if you look at everything from the perspective of enhancing trade or enhancing commerce, a lot of things that governments do can look pretty impartial, like saving the environment or little things like that could look pretty unobjective and not reasonable. So under this agreement, your domestic regulation, not your trade regulations, your domestic regulation, you have to reform it, you have to create a vehicle that private corporations can come and challenge all your laws. Under licensing, the domestic regulation provisions mean that once a sector like health or education are committed to be covered by the GATS, then the WTO sets up a body to determine whether or not the way you license your planners, your doctors, your nurses, your librarians is a barrier to trade. Okay? It will be their call whether or not the licensing for your doctors in Seattle has been set too high. Okay? Somebody should talk to the American Medical Association about this stuff. And anything that is looked on as more burdensome, again in the eyes of the WTO, than required to ensure the quality of a service can be struck down. So this is quite amazing that all of our professionals will be judged by a panel set up by the WTO to see whether or not these licenses are what they call a barrier to trade. A barrier to trade is anything that limits the service. So if you have high standards, you're limiting the number of doctors, and that is a barrier. Well, it's a barrier to high standards, I guess, but it's also, in the view of the WTO, excessively high standards are considered a barrier to trade, so it would be a no-no. Unlike goods, so I guess I'm making a pitch to say this is even worse than the other stuff. Unlike trade in goods, services, you usually have contact between the consumer and the producer of the service, okay? You take a cab, you deal with the cab driver, right? So you're in communication. Trade in goods can go right across borders. So all the stuff usually that they do in trade agreements deals with that stuff when it comes across borders, like customs, like tariffs. But again, in this way of reaching through the window and pulling your whole society through it, they're saying that domestic regulation can be a barrier when you look at that consumer and service provider relationship, because it limits the number of service providers. And this is according to one GATS expert. The GATS recognizes that trade and services can be hampered either by discriminatory regulatory requirements imposed only on foreign service providers, or by restrictive regulations that are imposed on both domestic and foreign services. So do people get what they're doing here? They're all of a sudden moving right into regulating what you do with your domestic service suppliers. The new round of negotiation on trade and services has to be seen as a key event in facilitating domestic reform of regulatory systems. So, again, a really big hint here, what they're doing, okay? Doesn't have to have anything to do with trade. They just can move in and set these international agreements on services so that you have to reform your local regulations. And remember, applies to federal, state, county, anybody who has delegated authority from government. So that would include NGOs that administer grants. This is pretty sweeping. So I'll try and give a concrete example. There are a lot of private health corporations worldwide, some of them in Germany, that are looking for places to invest. A German hospital could come into Seattle, and they would have the guaranteed right to set up here, right? It's the first clause in the agreement. So if a German corporation wanted to establish a hospital in Seattle and run it with cheap help, with doctors who, did marginally in some med school somewhere that you don't recognize, and underqualified nurses. And the local authorities objected, saying you're not meeting high enough standards. The German government could take a complaint to the WTO on behalf of this private hospital, saying that your local authorities were imposing qualifications that are more burdensome than necessary to ensure the quality of the service. Okay? You can tell where corporations are going with this. The U.S. Coalition of Service Industries, which includes Aetna, the healthcare giant, has asked the U.S. government to have the GATS negotiations address the problems, I put problems in quotation marks here, of restricted licensing of healthcare professionals and excessive, what they would call excessive, privacy and confidentiality regulations. Do you know where your medical files are right now? Okay. Trade in healthcare services and records is huge. Databases get sold to drug companies, and all of a sudden you get a message on your email saying, go with this drug company, right? So access to your healthcare data is a really, really powerful thing. and they're going for it. So they could, under the GATS, if healthcare gets covered, go after the privacy of healthcare records, saying it's excessive and it's a barrier to trade. So I hope I've got your attention. Another big hint, and this is what the Coalition on Service Industries has asked Charlene Bershevsky, you're a trade negotiator, to get out of this round of negotiations. And she asked them to tell her what they wanted. So you gotta believe that she's listening. In addition, the agreement says you have to allow, so you've got foreign service companies allowed to establish in Seattle. They have a guaranteed right to be here, and they have a guaranteed right to challenge if you set too high qualifications. The other aspects of this agreement are what's called consumption abroad, which means me as a consumer going abroad to get a service. Which doesn't seem so terrible, but I'll get into it. The other way is to have foreign service providers given an automatic right to come to your country, to the United States, and deliver the service. Okay? One of the most avid American promoters of free trade, Jagdish Bhagwati, in an article entitled "Free Trade Can Cut Healthcare Costs," has said, there is clearly tremendous potential to lower medical costs by importing more foreign doctors and exporting more patients. Now, he doesn't mean exporting them like never bringing them back, okay? Exporting them in terms of them doing this consumption abroad of the service. Yeah, I guess if you exported all your sick people, I guess you'd save on it. Never thought of it that way. He recommends that the U.S. issue temporary visas to foreign doctors whose ability to practice would be judged not by your local authorities, but because he views these as tainted with vested interests, right? But by international bodies concerned about freeing up trade. So Bhagwati says, and remember you can't, you think, oh well, we just go crazy and we get that overturned, but this is the WTO, right? There's nothing that's ever been overturned, so people just don't take on the WTO because the sanctions that they can authorize are hundreds of millions of dollars each year, plus all the trade retaliation. So you just don't take on these guys. Bhagwati says another way to lower costs is to take patients to where the cheaper health services are, pointing out that open heart surgery costs 1/10 if it's delivered in India than if it's carried out in the United States. Of course, people can already fly abroad if they want to. People do it all the time to get whatever surgery they want. A lot of people come to the States. But this could be enforced on your public healthcare systems. So Medicaid, for example, could possibly be forced to make patients cross the border, presumably to Mexico, if cheaper treatments were available. So that's one of the ways you can think that consumption abroad would come back to bite you. The whole idea of exporting patients and importing, these guys are so fixed on trade, they forget that these are sick people we're talking about. You don't want them flying off all over the world, coming home. It's just kind of a wild perspective. But again, it's what you get into if you see everything through the lens of trade. The other huge part of the GATS that, again, reaches right into Seattle and tells you what to do is the market access provisions. A former assistant to the U.S. Trade Representative says, the GATS article on market access extends beyond traditional concerns of access for foreign service suppliers to encompass all policies which restrict access to a market. This is a major, thank you for that, this is a major extension of multilateral trade disciplines into the realm of domestic policy. And this guy actually supports it, right? You know, he thinks this is good. But, you know, again, we have to listen to what these people are saying. He views the GATS negotiations as, I guess, an opportunity. We might see it as a threat, to create a major extension of multilateral trade disciplines into the realm of domestic policy. Now, as an outside observer, it seems to me that one of the problems Americans are facing is not that they have an overregulated service sector. 74% of Americans work in the service sector, and that's partly because free trade has hammered you and made you lose a lot of manufacturing jobs. So again, when we're talking about the significance of services and going, oh, so what's a service? It's like dry cleaning. No, it's 74% of what people do for a living in the United States. And people who work in the service industry tend to work very long hours. They work beyond, because they're often not salaried employees. They often work at home. So a study that was recently published by the International Labor Organization showed that American workers are just completely overworked. People feel tired. There is a reason for that. American workers are just putting in huge, long hours, long work weeks. 1/5 of all Americans now work more than 49 hours a week. Okay? So this is a demand in the 19th century to get an 8-hour week, 40-hour week, an 8-hour day. And we sort of retreated quite a bit from that. So now Americans are working 9 weeks longer annually on average than the average European worker. So that's, you know, you think about what you could do with 9 weeks over a year. You know, spend more time with your kids or whatever, get involved in more civic stuff. It's just horrendous. And in the American context, since 1979, American workers are working 2 months longer per year than they were doing in 1979. So one of the things that Americans identify when they say, you know, what's my biggest problem, they sometimes talk about what's happening to their families and the lack of time they have for their families. And you can see that this completely unregulated sector, where people just work like dogs around the clock sometimes when they've got rush projects, maybe a cut in those hours that they have to work would be good, maybe some regulation. In France, for example, where productivity is actually higher than, productivity gains in France are actually higher than in the United States. They're enforcing a 35-hour work week. I just think how nice that would be. So basically, again, to emphasize, you don't have to have any corporation banging at your door to have to reform your regulations if your government accepts to have your sectors covered by the GATS. That's why I think the name General Agreement on Trade and Services is so misleading. One of the articles under market access says that governments cannot discriminate against a service supplier on the basis of what kind of legal entity it is. Again, this is sort of the old boring trade language that puts everybody off. Well, what's an illegal entity? That's a public institution, or it's a wholly owned subsidiary from Germany, or it's a non-profit. Governments are not allowed under the GATS to make a distinction. So, subsidies are covered. You give a subsidy to a library, can that be contested under the GATS? They apply this provision that you're not allowed to discriminate. And I love it when they borrow our language, they say discriminate is a bad thing. You know, giving preference to nonprofit institutions should not have a nasty word like discrimination attached to it. It should be something like promote or, you know, value public nonprofit institutions. But instead, we don't want to discriminate in favor of them. So subsidies are covered. I don't know if people work for the public sector here, but think about your libraries and think about, let me think, any kind of public daycare, if you've got preferences for non-profit daycares, that kind of thing. Oh yeah, that's a big one. Forgot about the judicial system. Okay. So here's another sort of concrete example of how the GATS would affect a specific sector. And in case, I always have to, I've worked with these very, very good people within the British Columbia government, and they were sympathetic to making sure that people understood how bad things would be, but they also always warned me about being alarmist. You don't want to overstate your case. You want to be accurate in this stuff. But every time, I think, well, maybe I'm being alarmist, I go and read the stuff on the World Trade Organization site. And it's just incredible. I mean, they will say just flat out that there's positive trends because things are being privatized. They just say that as though everyone is on board with this analysis. The WTO just last year put out a contract on higher education. They led a contract to a private firm to do a study on higher education, and this firm just scoured the globe to find any example anywhere of regulation or a measure that would impede trade in higher education. And the organization that they gave it to was something called the Global Alliance for Transnational Education. I always think of the Dave Barry term. I'm not making this up, but it's just. So the Global Alliance for Transnational Education gets the study. It puts up on its website, I think it's still up there, asking people to send in email messages ratting on their own governments. Is there any example in your country of a restrictive practice that gives preference to local institutions, right? And it tells people that they can do this anonymously, but reassures them that they are not committing treason by saying this. Again, I am not making this up. You can go to this website and read this tonight. I guess some of us could dispute that, when citizens are actively solicited to report on their own governments in favor of international corporations. So some examples of the nasty things he's looking for are laws limiting degrees to be conferred only by or through national universities. I don't know if that applies in the US. We'd have to talk about that later. Policies or laws discriminating against private institutions of higher education. So again, governments could not give a preferential subsidy to a public higher education institution or a college. And that would have huge ramifications in Canada. And policies which do not fully recognize foreign educational credentials. And again, you just have to sort of think through the implications of what that would mean in terms of American policy. So anyways, if the GATS is so bad, why haven't I heard about it? Okay, that's... If it's so alarming, why don't we know? Well, you could say because the new media will never tell you about it, but, they didn't tell us about the MAI either. And there have been some disputes that have gone to the WTO under the Agreement on Trade and Services. One of them was the banana dispute. Anybody heard of that? Where the U.S., this is a great crowd, the U.S. government on behalf of Chiquita and Del Monte challenged European efforts to promote banana growers in the Caribbean. That was a GATS dispute. The other one was our poor little attempt in Canada to preserve 3% of our magazine market for our own magazines. We're so pushy in Canada, We're just right out there. Anyways, that was struck down too, and that was under the General Agreement on Trade and Services. But now the ante is being upped in a massive, sweeping way. in order to get any agreement whatsoever, because understandably, a lot of countries that are only aspiring to have public services didn't want to sign an agreement on trade and services that would just preempt any hope they ever had towards industrialized nations' kind of regulation and lifestyle and all the things that we enjoy. I mean, this would just cut it right off at the pass. So third world countries and developing nations in particular were very reluctant to sign. The US got them to sign by saying you just have to put forward the things you want to put forward. So a lot of people just put forward luxury hotels. They didn't care about them. They could do whatever they wanted. So luxury hotels were covered. And they also said you don't have to have the whole of the agreement apply. Even if you put forward something like luxury hotels, maybe you don't have one of the provisions apply, like foreign services or foreign service workers being able to work at the hotel. So it was very non-threatening for people to sign on to this thing and not worry about it. Well, now they're changing. They want to change the way the agreement is negotiated from this piecemeal thing where you put something in and you sort of take it back, to putting everything, all 160 sectors, on the table at the same time. Okay? So that, I'm going to give you a quote from a guy who actually has a pivotal role in coming up with the draft agreements for this kind of stuff. His name's Rolf Adlon. He works for the WTO Services Division. And what he says about how great it would be just to put everything on the table at the same time is he says, in particular, it could help to include countries, measures and sectors which, reflecting lack of interest on the part of the larger players, have hitherto eluded, running away, trying to elude these people, have hitherto eluded significant reform, or at least bindings. The onus would be on the domestic interest group, seeking to avoid liberalization, thus reducing the burdens on administrations to cajole them into participation. See how efficient this is, you know? Basically, this might prove particularly difficult in areas such as health and education. And again, I'm not making this up. I can send you the paper where he said this. So you can see how efficient a change in the negotiating, from just putting one thing forward at a time, each country doing that, to putting all the 160 sectors on the table at once. Rather than politicians having to muck around and actually consult with people and consult with sectors and the general public about whether a particular service should be subjected to the GATS, you get all sectors on the table at once, and then groups and countries have to scramble to get services they care about protected. Since there are 160 sectors potentially covered by the agreement, everything from park maintenance to university education to sewer and water services, everything being up for grabs at once would be a monumental challenge to groups and unions trying to protect the public interest. Now, that Adlon borrows a very interesting image. High technology. We had a little test before. Whoops.
Uh-oh.
I never rely on technology.
This is not yet.
My experience always fails. Now, can people see that at the back of the room? Can people see this? The video people are going to see the way. No, our plan is. Okay, can people see that now? Mr. Adlon, and remember, this is the guy who works for the World Trade Organization. He says the great thing about the World Trade Organization is because it's like Ulysses. Anybody remember? Greek mythology, Ulysses.
Need your megaphone. Your
Microphone, please.
Which one? Okay. Ulysses tying himself to the mast to avoid being called off course by the sirens. Okay? Now this is, so a WTO official is saying the good thing about the GATS is that, like the Ulysses myth, and maybe I'll just explain that a bit for those of you who slept through classical Greek mythology in high school. This is one of the trials of Ulysses, right? He's going back, he's sailing, trying to get home to Ithaca after he's finished sacking Troy, which was the city, not the Star Trek character. Okay. Okay, so anyways, he's on his way and he faces a whole bunch of different trials and tribulations. One of them is he has to pass the island where the sirens live. And the sirens are sea nymphs, and they sing so sweetly that they draw sailors off course and they founder on the rocks, okay? So Ulysses' task was, how do I pass the sirens without going off course and having my ship break up and everybody die? So the solution was, he had his crew bind him to the mast of his ship, and his crew stopped their ears with beeswax, okay, so they couldn't hear the call of the sirens. Now this is the analogy that a top WTO official says is what the advantage of the WTO is. He says that governments are like Ulysses, being bound to the mast of the ship of state so that they can avoid hearing what he calls the interest groups from citizens calling him off course, calling these governments off course, okay? I just find it an absolutely astonishing anti-democratic image. He even says later on in his paper that sometimes governments sign things, and I had an interesting talk with Maria just before we began. Sometimes governments sign things and they don't understand the full implications. They don't understand how strong the bindings are going to be. Well, Mr. Adlung thinks this is a good thing because sometimes WTO unelected, secretive dispute panels interpret these agreements far beyond what the elected representatives of governments intended. He thinks this is a good thing. These are the people who work for the World Trade Organization. If you think you're going to get justice for labor or for the environment out of these people, I think you're looking in the wrong place. But let's look at this image from a democratic perspective. Politicians are allowing themselves to be bound, and they actually use this language in trade circles. These are bindings. Governments are going to be disciplined. It all sounds sort of sadomasochistic, actually. There's a clause in the GATS called the gods, and you're actually supposed to follow the disciplines under the gods. You know, it's all, I mean, it would be hard to satirize if it wasn't true. So you have these bindings where politicians are not supposed to, and they call us interest groups, you know, labor, the environment, we're all interest groups that call governments off course. In other words, citizens. The citizens are calling governments off course. We're not even considered to be on the ship of state. We're on this island. We are like the other. People have studied literary theory. We're like the other. We're faceless. We're dangerous. We're calling governments off course to their deaths. And the only thing governments can do, not to respond to our sweet songs, and maybe these are sweet songs about universal health care, and maybe they're sweet songs about good public services or more equality and more justice. But governments are bound by the WTO not to listen to us. And then we can look at the crew. Anybody got some ideas about who the crew might be? This is actually a really good tool for workshops, and I brought copies with me. People want to use it. Again, there's no intellectual property rights on this stuff. So who could the crew be? Maybe the crew. Well, they usually don't work. They don't do the work. Other people do the work, like Nike. Charlene Bershevsky, trade representatives, like it's. Yeah. You could think of these, this crew that has stopped up its ears not to listen to us as being the people who are supposed to be representing us at these trade negotiations. It would be Charlene Barshevsky for you, Leon Britton for the Europeans, and our guy Sergio Marchi for Canadians. So they're rowing away and they're not listening to us, right? And they've bound our political leaders with these trade agreements. So no matter what kind of sweet and enticing songs we're singing, they're not going to listen to us. And so they've got their ears blocked with beeswax, which might be neoliberal ideology maybe. You can just there's lots of things you can do with this image. And maybe the image, rather than the way Adlon uses it, we can start sort of looking at it as what the challenge is before us. That we need people to represent us at these trade negotiations who will truly listen to us and represent our interests. Or maybe we'll stop the boat. And maybe we need to elect politicians who are not eager to be bound up in this way and who are actually interested in governing. Well, that's a concept, eh? Maybe then we could see the ship of state heading in the direction of the public interest.
Take questions right now for Ellen, just to keep this conversation going about 15 minutes. There's a microphone over here.
That's just GATSINFO @AOL.com. So it's a real easy one. You make commitments, and it's not as though they insist on privatization. They just say you have to compensate, which to me is the same thing. If you have to pay megabucks to compensate every time you change a policy direction, it means you're stuck for all time. So just want to sort of clarify one thing so that you don't get tripped up by people being snotty about this stuff. General agreement on tariffs and trade, that's what the WTO sort of evolved out of, right? That's the GATT. We've been talking this evening about something called the GATS. So now you are really 100% more knowledgeable than lots of people in your government. And that question's... Sure.
Well, I just have one question about the enforcement, which is not clear. How is this enforced? I don't understand the government's control the power within the country in a lot of armies and things like that. How can there be enforcement for these trades?
Right. Okay. This is called, they have a whole unit called the Dispute Settlement Unit. The WTO cannot rewrite your laws. I'll say that right up front. They cannot go to the Congress and go, paragraph 6 has to be changed. They don't do that. What they say is if you want to continue to have this thing, once it's been challenged, and some other country has to challenge it, right? Like under the Clean Air Act, it's challenged by Venezuela, the American Clean Air Act. was challenged by Venezuela because they wanted to keep exporting polluting gas to you. So your Clean Air Act was challenged. It was not struck down. The WTO didn't say you have to change it in this or that way. They just said, sure, you can have it, but you have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars every year you keep the regulation in place. So you don't pay. The other thing that they can do is all U.S. exports, and this is probably the more heavy-duty one, okay? Venezuela, I don't know what Venezuela imports from you, but say Europe. Europe could say, okay, we're going to put 100% duty on U.S. steel. And what would U.S. Steel say to the American government? Change your regulation now. And they do. They have it every single case. Every single country has buckled because it would mean that they would have a whole bunch of domestic industries on their case. And also, what country can afford to pay, even big guys like you guys, can you afford to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to keep your regulations in force? So, I mean, ideally, you could say governments could say no. They just never do.
Wait, could Europe say, could Europe say that the same, put those hundreds of millions of taxes on U.S. imports, even if the WTO weren't there?
This is WTO sanctioned. This is the whole thing about it being a rules-governed environment. What they often argue is that the WTO is good because it's rules and it's, not the big guys beating up on the little guys, but everybody agrees to play by the same rules. If you withdraw from that club, you're not protected by the rules and everybody can have at you, right? And that's a very vulnerable position, and that's why they can coerce everybody to stay inside and not challenge a WTO ruling. Actually, Europe is challenging. Do people know about the beef hormone? This is the most incredible case. 90% of North American beef, and I'll talk about Canadian beef so you don't feel sensitive about it. 90% of Canadian beef is laced with hormones. I think about 4 months ago, the European Union had a scientific panel report that said it in a wonderful sort of translation from the French kind of way, that the beef hormones that are being used are a complete and total carcinogen, okay? So if you have beef in your fridge right now, I don't know. I mean, I threw mine out after reading this European report. The only way this whole story got reported in Canada was that we weren't going to be able to import Werther's gumdrops. When everything is seen through a trade lens, it just becomes a very bizarre world. We didn't get a headline, even a dismissive one, saying Europeans are saying, even though they're lying, that hormone-treated beef is carcinogenic, even if they dismissed it. But that's not how the story was reported. It was reported in the business pages, and you got to like paragraph number 19, and that's where it said, and the Europeans have a scientific report saying that all hormone-treated beef is carcinogenic. So it's just, in terms of your values in a society, do we value human health? Do we value the precautionary principle? No. We value trade and, whether or not we can get Werther's chocolates and things like that. I mean, it was a bizarre story. The specifics of this study, which are available on the European Union's website, are worth reading because they investigated the veterinary practices of Canadian beef farmers and found, they're supposed to put the hormone in the ear so that that's not used in a place where people normally get cuts of meat. And They find that they inject the hormones wherever. It's totally unregulated. You can be getting a cut of beef, and it can be where the hormone is injected. And they did a study on baby food. I won't mention brand name just in case, but they did a study of baby food, and they found that there was just massive, massive amounts of hormone way beyond what children should be consuming. Why wasn't it a story in North America? Anyways, the Europeans are taking this on. It's the first time. They're going to take the sanctions. They're going to...
I think we're live now. Thanks a lot. Seems like the net effect of all of these configurations of trade bureaucracies and the WTO's apparatus are intent on destroying community in the world in favor of a future transnational government planning. I had a recent communication with Keith Rockwell, who you might know, the Director of Media Relations and India Relations for the WTO. And the question I asked him was, in one of his papers, he described the difference in the WTO agreements as governments are now entered into business contractual relationships with each other through the Marrakesh Agreement and all subsequent WTO agreements. And I asked him, does that mean that in international law, the traditional state-to-state relations are now being subsumed within a new commercial regime, meaning that different rules of international law apply now, eliminating the distinction between states and private corporate entities? He replied in the affirmative and said that the WTO is the beginning of a new set of international jurisprudence, whereby state-to-state relations are subsumed in favor of entity relations as defined under commercial law. Just a point of information. I wanted to ask you, what does the GATS have to say on 2 points? One is electronic commerce and the provision of services across national borders through internet-related enterprise. And second, since the GATS seems to talk so much about healthcare and education, how does it impact labor issues, i.e. many kinds of labor could be seen as obviously services? How is that distinction created? Thanks.
Well, you have to wonder why they're going against education and health, and they identify that so strongly. I think it's because it's organized. That's where your organized sectors, your organized workers in the United States are. 15% rate of organization, and I bet a huge whack of that is in the public service. The question, I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question? That's probably why I forgot it. They're even having a hard time defining whether or not internet commerce should go under the GATT or under the GATS, because they don't know if it's a good, because it comes over the internet. But if you, again, use the criterion of whether or not you can drop it on your foot, well, you can't drop an email message on your foot, but if you printed it off, you could drop that on your foot, right? So the Americans want it under the GATT, and the rest of people want it under the GATS. And on these things, there's so much else coming down the pike at us. They always use technology to say we can't do anything other than this. And the internet is constantly used as we cannot stop this, we cannot regulate this, we have no power. And this is domination by technology, and it's a big fib. Because the technology obviously because we know that the National Security Agency is using it to track stuff. So if they're using it to monitor and track, then obviously governments could use the internet to monitor and track and tax and whatever could be regulated the same. It's not, you got to dump the technological determinism. They'll first tell you that it's good to give everything over to the invisible hand of the market, and then they'll say, well, if that doesn't work, you can't do anything about it anyways because of technology. So that's the concept that we have to go after. I'm too long.
Well, no, we've had questions for 15 minutes, and Councilmember Brian Derdowski has got to get back to his campaign, so maybe we could have the rest of these questions at the end. Is that okay?